Welcome, everyone, to the May edition of the Centerville, Iowa Memories podcast. With me here today are Luke Eddy and I am Lisa Eddy. We're both from the Appanoose County Historical Society, as is our guest today, Tyler Morgan. He is going to visit with us mainly about the municipal band here in Centerville, but really to start with, I'd like to hear more about Tyler, his career, and his book that he wrote, History of Bands of Centerville, Iowa. Tyler, tell me about yourself, your career, who you are, that kind of thing.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me today. Like you said, I'm Tyler Morgan, and currently I am the high school band director here at Centerville High School. And in regards to the municipal band, I've been the director of the Centerville Municipal Band since 2012. So just going on a little over 10 years now. I'm a native of Centerville, lived here my entire life, except for a few years away at college. I came back to teach here in the band program in 2014 and have been here ever since. And I'm just really happy to be here and involved in the community. I'm involved with the Historical Society and other organizations like that. My book, I started writing back in college. In its infant states, was a lot about just kind of getting pictures together with some captions, and then I kind of just grew it into writing some narrative about the history and was fascinated by some of the stories. And so I formed it into a formal book that, when looking back, took me about probably 8 or so years to write. I wanted to publish it in 2019, which was the 150th anniversary of the municipal band and the 100th anniversary of the Centerville Schools Band. So that was my main goal, to get it published in 2019, and which I did. And it's got a great reception ever since, and I'm happy to talk about this history that is really, I think, pretty fascinating.
So Tyler, tell us about the municipal band, like who they are, what they do, when they perform, so that we'll be ready for it.
Sure. The municipal band is a group made up of community members. You're eligible to join the municipal band after you finished your 8th grade year. So when you're going to be an incoming freshman into high school, that's the earliest age that we have musicians perform in the band. And then we have musicians of all ages from the community and all walks of life that join us to play. We're just really happy to be able to get together and enjoy music together. We give 5 concerts a year. We start the Thursday after Memorial Day with our first concert and give concerts every Thursday evening leading through June. And they start at 8 p.m. up on the square in the band shell, like they have been for as long as I can remember, and for a lot of other people's memory. That's how we did it, was on Thursday evenings, and where crowds can come and bring a lawn chair or blanket and sit down and listen to the concert of a variety of music, popular music, and some more traditional march type music as well.
So, Tyler, I know you said you were the director of the band since 2012. How long have you been a member of that band?
Well, I've been involved with the band since 2005. And so I just did the math the other day. That makes it, at this time, 18 years that I've been involved as a musician or the director in some way. And it still is one of the highlights of my year, and definitely a highlight of my summer every year, in getting to participate and be a part of the group.
So, when exactly did this municipal band begin, and how did it get started?
So the band actually got its start in 1869. And so that's why I was saying earlier that in 2019 was kind of a monumental year for us. That was the 150th anniversary. And being in 1869, I mean, there's not a lot of records of what went on around then, besides a few scraps of newspapers that we have available to us. And the first mention of the band that I could find going backwards was actually in 1871 in a newspaper, where it calls the band being formed 2 years prior. So doing the math, 1869 is when it must have started. And that newspaper article in 71 is actually pretty interesting, because the band was traveling to Corden to perform at the Wayne County Fair for a band competition where there was 3 bands, the Centerville, Corden, and the Leon band were all performing that day. And at the time, the band, Centerville Band, only had about 11 members in it, from what I can tell. And they got in the bandwagon with a horse drawn and went over there and competed at the contest and brought home the blue ribbon for that contest. I think they won $50, it might have been. So a lot of money back then. But it's really interesting that that's kind of the first mention of the band that we have. And if you fast forward a little bit afterwards, the band starts to grow in its performances and in its kind of structure too. So it is 154 years old, and we're just celebrating every year as we keep going on, and when we get to some of those big milestones, we have some big celebrations too.
So how is it that they've been able to remain intact for all those years? I've never known of any group that has lasted that long.
That's actually a great question, because I think I attribute it to a lot of the rich musical history that we have in our town, in our community, and even in our county. When you talk about the band staying together, there is an interesting story about the early years of the band. In the mid to late 1870s, the band's been around for less than 10 years at this point. There was what the papers called a temperamental difference between some of the band members, and the Centerville Band actually split into two different bands, and with some little interesting names. The one was called the Light Guard Band, and the other was called the Mastodon Brass Band. Now, I have no idea where those names came from. One is a little bit more normal sounding for a band than the other, but those were the two bands that remained in town for quite a while, until a very important gentleman happened to move to town in 1881 by the name of George Landers. Now, George Landers came to our town from New York to be employed as a carriage painter. He stayed in the Continental Hotel when he first moved to town, and was really not planning to be involved much in music until some of the local musicians heard him playing his clarinet out the open window of the Continental Hotel and got him involved with the music program, and they quickly learned about his skills. He had played in circus bands back in New York, and they learned of his skills, and he quickly rose to the position of leader of the town bands and fixed some of those temperamental differences between the bands and kind of reorganized them into one much stronger band than they were apart, pooling the resources of Centerville's musicians into making quite a fine band for what we had in our community and for being, still considered a small town in the Midwest.
So what type of events were the municipal bands involved in back in the beginning?
So in the beginning, or in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there wasn't a lot of entertainment around, and there wasn't nearly the options of recorded music that we have now. So the band was like the soundtrack of almost any event that you could be having in town. Big or small, really, individual parties sometimes, or big community events the band played for. They were playing all the time, and they were a contracted organization. They were, were paid for events. The musicians were paid to play in the band, and they were just really at everything. Parades, they were always there. Community events, 4th of July celebrations especially, the band played a lot of those. And the Chautauquas, which were different celebrations that have different performers, different speakers the band was definitely there for those as well. So, and in addition to that, of course, they gave their concerts, and their season was much longer than our season now, since they were kind of dedicated to that specific avenue of their lives, and our musicians come from different avenues when they converge to play in the band. So the band back at the beginning gave quite regular concerts throughout the season, even throughout the winter. They gave indoor concerts, whether it be at the Armory Opera House or sometimes at Russell Hall, all historic places that you may have heard about at one time or another, or may hear about in future podcast episodes.
So were there any notable people in the band or leading the band that people would know?
Yeah, so there were, of course, over the years we've had a lot of directors, and we had a lot of people perform in the band. As far as the directors go, back in the beginning, of course, the director of the band was paid for just that. Like, that was their entire job, George Landers being one of the very early directors that I mentioned already. And it wasn't until a few years later, in around in the 1920s, where we hired a director by the name of William Gower. That name is fairly well known amongst the music scene of Iowa. He went on to teach at the Iowa City Schools and a little university as well. But William Gower was hired by Centerville to be the director of the municipal band. And after a few years of that, he was actually hired by the schools to help the school band form a marching band, He helped them form a marching band. And that was at the first point where the two positions kind of intermingled, where after that point, whoever the high school band director was also was the director of the municipal band for some time. And William Gower was really the first one to start that, and it went through several directors. Names that some people might know. Bob Donaldson was there for quite a while. Following him, Mark Kelly, a very well-known band name in the Midwest. And then on John Holman and on to other directors that we had. Whoever was at the high school was the municipal band director as well. In fact, until that was the case until my taking over. When I took over in 2012, I was still finishing up college, and myself and my good friend Mark Taylor, who was at the time the elementary band director here at Centerville, took on as co-directors of the group. We directed the band, and then I continued directing the band even as the elementary director, and of course now I'm the high school director, so it's kind of come full swing with that whole rule kind of that we used to operate by. And as far as members of the band, there's a few names that come to mind. The first and probably the most famous one is Jaime Voxman, which I'm sure some people would have known, especially if you went to the University of Iowa, the Voxman Music Hall or Music Building, I believe it's called. And he wrote several music instruction books, music etude books that are still used around the country and I'm sure around the world today. And he was quite prolific in his offerings and his contributions to the concert band scene throughout everywhere. And he was from Centerville and got his start in Centerville and played along with a municipal band as well from a much younger age than probably what we allow now. But he was quite the exception, I would say, when he was a young clarinet player. But so that's the first name that comes to mind as one of the more notable members of our band. And of course, anyone who's come through the program, the Centerville Band program, who has probably played in the municipal band and gone on to have a career in music, has, I'm sure, would be ringing the minds of most people.
So Tyler, I know that you've also included in your book and in the history that you've been writing about the history of the bandstands. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I know we've had 4, but beyond that, maybe you could give us a little more description.
Yeah, so the first bandstand, the whole process for having a bandstand or a place for the band to perform and also to have public events if needed, was started in about 1890, 1891, and George Landers actually published an article in the Daily Iowegian where he wanted to bring attention to the fact of a need for such a bandstand for the reasons I said before, and tried to garner support from the business owners and the people of Centerville. And that actually did end up making progress and going through. And in 1892, the first bandstand was built. I like to describe it as very gazebo-like. You might see a modern-day gazebo that looked a lot like the bandstand. It only fit about 15 or 20 people. It was not very big, and it was an all-wood structure. And in about the same spot as where the current bandstand sits on the courthouse lawn right now. An interesting piece of information, of course, the band gave a lot of concerts there, and they had public addresses given in that location as well. They actually wanted to move the bandstand, and by they I mean some, we'll call it concerned citizens or some people within the community wanted to move the bandstand because they were concerned that the band members and concert goers were trampling the grass and not allowing the grass to grow on the courthouse lawn, which seems quite petty at this moment, but at the time it was a big deal. And there was quite the fight in the battle because they wanted to pick it up and move it to a different location, or probably in the city park or somewhere like that. And they stopped that, which is fortunate because it's kind of one of the allures of the bandstand to be on the Centerville Square and to be kind of like a gem up on the corner there where people can see it throughout all of its iterations. And as far as concerts go, the fact that you can sit on the courthouse lawn or park in your car more modernly and listen to the band is quite a feature of the band. However, that was the first band, and like I said, it was Bandstand, and it was made all out of wood, so it did not last very long. In about 1915, 1914-ish probably, they started to see a need for a new bandstand because the current one was just in bad disrepair. Being made of wood, it was starting to fall down and just be unsafe for use by the band, and they wanted a little bit more space as well. So by 1915, a second bandstand was built, and this one was a little bit different. It was more of like a rectangular raised stone platform. It didn't have a roof initially when it was built, more of just like a raised platform for the band to sit upon and to play from. And I should say that both of the bandstands, the money for which was kind of gathered, there were some fundraiser events, but most of the money was gathered by the merchants and the business owners of Centerville, and especially of the square, helping donate funds, a little bit from the city as well, to build these. And that remains to be true about the remaining structures I'll talk about in a moment. But the second bandstand was built in 1915, as I said, and it served its purpose quite well. It lasted a lot longer than the previous one, almost a little over 40 years, honestly. And later on in its lifetimes, a kind of trellised roof was built on it with electrical lights to help light it when it got dark in the evenings. And so it was considered to be quite more modern. However, a time came when it was just too small. There was not enough space for the growing band program, the growing municipal band, and a need was evident for a different bandstand. And that's when in 1959 we got our third bandstand. And now one of the features of this bandstand is a very mid-century kind of modernist looking iron beamed roof that was not completely enclosed, but it had a little bit of a roof on it, and it just looked very, very futuristic, which was a lot of the style at that time, to make things look very futuristic with the iron beams and everything. But it was a tiered bandstand, band shell, some call it, very similar to the one we have now, and it served its purpose for allowing a lot more space for the band. Mark Kelly was told that we need something that directs, when he was trying to get this new bandstand built, he said, we need something that will direct the sound to people, because in our current bandstand, the sound just goes up into the air. We need to have a tiered system that will direct the sound to the people listening to the band, and that's why they had this new kind of design that we used for the third bandstand, and subsequently the fourth bandstand, which looks similar in as far as the base design of the stand as to the third bandstand. Later on, a different roof was kind of put on and modified a little bit for that third bandstand, because it sat for about just under 50 years before a next renovation was done. And that final renovation for what we call the fourth bandstand, the current one, was done in 2005. Quite a large fundraising effort was done to make the stone on the outside very similar to that of the courthouse, as well as the tile roof being very reminiscent of the tile roof of the Appanoose County Courthouse. And it is a fine structure with a built-in sound system for all sorts of events that are housed around there. Definitely great for the band. When we dedicated that in 2005, I was actually a member of that band, sitting in the band playing alongside my mother. We dedicated, there were a ton of guests that came to both direct and play. Jaime Voxman, who I mentioned earlier, he was there playing. And it was a great experience looking back on the pictures of it, of all the people that came for that event in 2005. So that's the quick gist of the 4 bandstands that we've had so far, and it's quite a long history of that structure there on the courthouse lawn.
Thanks, Tyler. That has been a great overview of the municipal band and the band shells. But I know that your book has not only municipal band history and the band shell history, but history of a lot of other music aspects in Centerville. And as we close, I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So in my book, I start off by talking about the municipal band's history since it started the earliest of anything that happened in my book. The history, as I talked about early at the very beginning, and then on into a really interesting chapter which talks about the military band history of the Centerville Municipal Band, where, just to say briefly about it, the George Landers had the municipal band mustered into the Iowa National Guard, and they were an official band of the National Guard and performed the duties as such, and actually was called into service. Members of the band, including Landers, were called into service during the Spanish-American War in 1898 and went to the Philippines and performed over there, and then came back and at the end of that conflict and toured for several different seasons, telling about their stories in the Philippines and displaying different artifacts they brought back with them. And that's just a really interesting chapter I recommend as well. And then, of course, chronicling the rest of the municipal band history through modern times. After the municipal band section is the section on the Centerville High School Band, or the Centerville Schools Band, I should say, rather, which is quite attractive to a lot of people who pick up the book who were band members in their youth and wanting to hear or see their stories in there, or just learn a little bit more about the history of the band program. I talk about the very early years when the high school band got started in 1919, and on through different accolades that the band won through contests and competitions. A whole chapter that I wrote about surviving the high school fire in the 30s, so that we can, how the band survived and went on to do some great things despite that setback in their year, and all the directors as well during those times. And so a lot of information there on the Centerville High School Band. And like I said, I have a whole section dedicated to the directors of the school bands, the years they directed, a photo of them, and their little brief about them. At the end of the book, I have 3 biographical sections where I talk about a few important members that have either been a part of music in Centerville or got their start here. I talk about George Landers, of course, Jaime Voxman, which I mentioned earlier as well. Roy Hauser is another person I talk about a little bit, who got his start here in the Centerville Band program and went on to teach at the collegiate level, won several competitions for his playing ability. Some interesting stories. The Gower's family, William Gower, I should say, the director I talked about, who started the marching band program, and his son as well, who went on to be a professional musician after getting his start in the Centerville Band program. And there's also all sorts of little stories sprinkled out in different chapters amongst the book about Scarlet and Black, the school song, and how it got its start, the silent movie orchestra that we had here at the Majestic Theater, and you may find something in there that you definitely didn't know before. So I recommend picking up if you're at all interested about some musical history of Centerville.
And we have those books at the Appanoose County Historical and Coal Mining Museum. So stop by and pick up a copy. And thank you, Tyler, for helping us out with our podcast today.